Well, welcome back, you brave souls who decided to come back for a second helping. It's good to see you all here this morning. It's the morning, right? Okay. So, we're going to start out by admitting to the fact that I screwed up in at least 2 and maybe even 3 items last time, which some of you were so good to point out to me. And I am most appreciative of that. Errata item number 1. I said the Talbot boys statue was taken down at the dead of night. Wrong. Taken down during the day. I got it mixed up with, there was another Confederate statue somewhere that in fact was taken down. I think it was on a university campus within the last year or 2. The college administrators, in typical fashion, snuck in the dead of night and took the statue away. Second errata. I said there were 90, I think I said 94, not signatures, but names on the Talbot boy statue. Wrong. Now, what the right number is interesting. The gentleman who pointed it out asserted 84, and I've seen that number, but I've also come across 81, and I think 85, some other source. So exactly what the number is, and since it's not there anymore, we can't just go out and count it. But it's certainly not 94. Let's take 84. And number 3, which is the number I gave for the number of recruits for the Union Army that came from Talbot County. And I believe I've said something in the order of 350, something in there. And gentleman's not here today, pointed out that his research has said more like 550. Quite frankly, I can't find a definitive number anyplace. And the reason you can't find a definitive number, I suspect, is that for the Federal Army, soldiers, recruits, were not recruited on a county basis. They were recruited on a statewide basis. And so they were enlisted into the 1st Maryland Regiment or the 2nd Maryland Regiment or so on and so forth. So I cannot find an official listing of these are the fellows from Talbot County who went into the Union Army, much less the Confederate Army. The Confederate rolls are even more obscure. What is pretty certain, though, is the number of black Union recruits. And the reason that we're a little more certain on black Union recruits is that the federal government went to great lengths to document recruits that were being taken from given areas, if for no other reason than at the end of, well, not even at the end of the war, prior to the end of the war, and I think we noted this last time, the owners of the black recruits who were slaves were paid money, $300 a recruit. And so that then generated a certain amount of bookkeeping, which you didn't have for the white recruits, at least on a county-wide basis. Okay, so thank you again for pointing that out.
Well,
Right.
that's one of the fun things about Chesapeake Forum is that when we teach, our students also teach us.
Yes.
And what are your
Absolutely.
requirements for sources to
Okay.
verify that? I mean, someone said,
So last time we talked about some of the human aspects to the Civil War in Talbot County. We talked a little bit about some of the political dimensions to it. Today we want to talk about the economic and social dimensions to the war and its aftermath and its effects. And when we get into this area, be it either the economic or the social effects of the war, we candidly get into a degree of speculation. Because as we'll talk about, here, let me give you, for instance, Talbot County railroads. Yeah, I will argue that there wouldn't have been a railroad in Talbot County, at least not a railroad in the 1860s, without the Civil War. Now, someone else may argue, oh no, it would have happened anyway. It was happening other places, would have happened here. My thinking is it may well have happened, it probably would have happened at some point in time, but it wouldn't have happened in the 1860s for reasons that we'll get into. Okay, and as we go through this, if you want to argue with me or you want to dissent or you have another perspective, let's hear it and we'll go back and forth a little bit. Okay, so one of the interesting things about what's been written about Talbot County after the Civil War, in fact, from the 1865, 1870, right through to the 1920s, that 60, 70-year period, some historians and journalists and observers have pretty much portrayed Talbot County as being asleep during this period of time. That really nothing much happened of a significance in Talbot County. Some would argue even up to the 1950s, with, of course, the opening of the bridge. Only then do some observers suggest that really life as we know it in Talbot County began to evolve into modern form. I would argue otherwise, and we're going to illustrate some of that today. It certainly is the case that in the wake of the Civil War, nationwide, and here in Talbot County, that there were an array of economic and technological innovations that come to the fore. One of which was the railroad. Railroad was built initially in Talbot County. I believe, I'm not great on dates, I gotta admit, it's not my forte, but I believe 1867, 1868, you see the beginnings of the railroad, which was coming down from the north out of Baltimore and the like, being extended into Talbot County and into Easton. And as some of you were pointing out, that's the Easton Railroad Station that's still there today. Somebody needs to tell me what's going on with the railroad station. Make an excellent restaurant, you would think, for somebody, but that's neither here nor there. But beyond the railroad, you have, and we're going to flip through this and then go back and talk about some of them. Oystering comes to the fore after the Civil War. Oystering, this is the Valiant packing plant in Bellevue, Maryland. Everybody know where Bellevue is?
Yeah.
very.
Everybody seen the packing plant in Bellevue?
No.
Nobody's seen the packing plant because it ain't there. And you tell me, but I've been over there and I've looked fairly closely and I can't find any residue of it. I mean, not a foundation, not a sign that there was this, I mean, look at that.
That's a complex.
Hmm?
It's a whole complex.
Yeah, it's an incredible complex. The interesting thing about the packing plant and Bellevue itself is number one, there were two fellows who had the idea that this area across the river from Oxford would make an excellent site for a resort in the 1880s. Except it never happened for whatever reason. They couldn't make a go of developing a resort. They sold the site to another gentleman, and he builds a packing plant. I believe his name was Mr. Valiant. It's interesting where he gets a workforce. Anybody know anything about the workforce? Yeah, it's pretty much all black. Whether it was exclusively black or not, I don't know, but it was certainly largely black. And what's even more interesting, at least to me, is not so much that the workforce was black, but the town that grows up is a black town. And if you ride through that today, there's still a vestige of that. Some of the homes along the river itself look like they're of fairly recent vintage, but some of the homes further back off the river, my sense is, have probably been there for 100, 125 years and date back to the packing plant. This is an interesting place. The Royal Oak Manufacturing Plant.
What a combination.
Excuse me?
Undertaker?
I'm sorry.
Does that say Undertaker?
Yeah. And Undertaker. He did double duty. A manufacturing plant in Royal Oak. Now, today, again, you don't. Now, I'm not sure whether, in fact, this building is still there or not. This may be, if you go into Royal Oak from,
If you go in from Easton side.
oh yeah, if you go in from
left-hand
Easton,
side, there's some pretty chic.
I think this is the building on the left
Yeah.
that's still there at the crossroads, I think.
Is this
Can't-
the building across from T?
Yeah, it's,
Yeah.
I hesitate to say what it looks like, but it's, anything and everything is being sold there on both sides of the street. But this was a manufacturing plant and an undertaker.
What do they make? It looks like they need wheels.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure what they made, but it was metal of some sort or another. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves with this picture, but it's the only picture I could find of the ferry at Claiborne that goes back, God knows how far into the past. And this obviously is a picture from the, looks like maybe the 1930s. But the ferry was established after the Civil War and was, as I think, anybody ever ride that ferry here?
Are you talking about the Oxford ferry?
No, it's not Claiborne Ferry, Claiborne to Baltimore,
Oh,
or Claiborne to Annapolis.
Oh.
Well,
No
you
one
can
has
still
ridden-
see the ferry.
I rode the Mattapee ferry,
You rode it,
Before you get Whitney.
Mattapee where the bridge is. Not that one, but I've ridden the ferry.
yeah.
That's a
Yeah,
little-
the Claiborne ferry ran after the Civil War powered by initially steam engines developed not during the Civil War, but certainly stimulated by the Civil War and the use of steam engines for things like rivercraft, first for military purposes, and then after the war for things like this. What's the date that the Claiborne Ferry stopped running?
When cars came.
52.
When the bridge opened.
Oh, the bridge.
Yes, literally the day the bridge opened, the ferry stopped running. The end of an era, so to speak. What else we got? Oh, yes.
Didn't they have ferries coming into Easton too?
Excuse me?
Did they have ferries from Baltimore coming into Easton?
I'm not aware of such.
Not,
Well,
but a steamboat.
there was,
A steamboat.
Steamboat.
yeah,
Steamboats.
there was traffic between, well, not Easton.
Yes, Easton Point.
Easton Point?
Easton Point
Yeah.
was a
Yeah,
steamboat dock.
Wasn't that
Yeah.
the story about chicken neckers? You know, the whole idea that people would come from Baltimore over here to go crabbing, and so they
Yeah.
got the nickname of, they're calling them chicken neckers.
You still do.
Yeah.
There were multiple stops along the way, coming in from
Yeah.
Baltimore and Annapolis,
Huh.
Oxford,
Yeah, Oxford I was aware of. I was never aware of,
and it came
Easton.
on up, and the end of the line
Yeah.
was Easton.
Yeah, okay. The tractor. Again, an interesting history. There have been mechanized plows, which essentially is what evolved into the tractor, going, I was surprised to find, way back into the early 1700s over in Europe. And then were developed by the 1760s, the 1770s, were being put to good use for agricultural purposes in Europe, and then brought to the United States by the 1820s and the 1830s. But again, it's the Civil War that really puts the steam engine to significant use, with the best example of that, not so much the tractor, although there were uses for that during the war, but the steam engine on boats. And the best example of that, or the most famous example of that, is
Monitor America.
the Monitor and the Merrimack. Yeah. And so, again, while the war didn't cause the development of steam engines, the war certainly brought to the public and to the businessmen's attention the fact that this device could be put to good use. The other reason it could be put to good use is that what happens to manpower during the war?
Killed.
Yeah, two things happened to manpower during the war. One is that white manpower
Died.
is enlisted into the war effort, either the Union war effort or the Confederate war effort, particularly here in Maryland and here in Talbot County. Black manpower, what happens then? Two things happen to black manpower. One,
Slavery was abolished.
They were also in the war too, because they were paid. They were also in the war too, because
yeah,
white
Yeah.
would have blacks
yeah.
go into the war for them.
So there's two impulses on the, get it back to the camera here. There's two impulses on the part of black folk during the war. For many, they say, we want to enlist. We want to take part in the war effort. And that, of course, results in black manpower being shifted to military reasons. The other impulse is, I don't want to be in the war effort necessarily, but neither do I want to be here in Talbot County on this farm plantation. I want to go wherever, and usually it meant going north. All of that then suggests we need something to replace those people. How are we going to cultivate, both during and then after the war, without adequate manpower? And that's where that comes in, and the impulse for it. Without the war, there still would have been development, but I would argue not near the impulse that you had as a result of the war. All right. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, yeah. And Model T Fords in Easton. This is probably, what would you think, maybe 1910, 1915, something like that. The only reason I put it up, I can't argue that the Model T Ford was a product in any way of the war effort, although maybe you could in terms of some of the technical developments, but I'm not going to. Rather, I simply put it up there as an indication that by 1915, this, in my estimation, augurs the future for Easton, Talbot County, the Eastern Shore, with the development of the automobile. We'll talk about that a little bit more a little later on in the hour. But this was one technical change, along with, I would argue, the bridge that changed life here and, of course, elsewhere forever. All right. Yeah, we don't want to go there yet. The other thing that the war does for economic purposes, for those farmers who are able to stay in business, who are able either to hold on to their labor force or to use some of these technical advantages for their purposes, farmers in Talbot County who stay in operation make lots of money. And they make lots of money because all of a sudden there is this consumer called the federal government. And the federal government is buying lots and lots and lots of stuff. It's buying foodstuffs, it's buying textiles, it's buying all sorts of good stuff that farmers are more than happy to supply. And so rather than being a sleepy period in which nothing much is happening, for that segment of the economy during the war and then into the rest of the 19th century, demand for those foodstuffs remains solid. In fact, the number one problem for farmers in Talbot County after the Civil War is not no one's buying our stuff. There's more and more and more demand for their stuff. Coming from where? If the federal government is no longer buying it, who's buying it? Who? Yeah, people in
Industry.
Baltimore, people in Washington, people in Philadelphia, people in New York, these developing urban centers after the Civil War that are growing, if for no other reason, as a function of, for a couple of reasons, immigration. And immigration is occurring because of manufacturing and the need for labor. And so you have these markets for foodstuffs, and farmers have all sorts of opportunities to make money, except they can't get an adequate supply of labor. Yeah, labor. Labor simply isn't there. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second. Okay. Oh yeah, one other thing, okay? One other thing about the automobile. What also the advent of the automobile signals the demise, well, it's not the demise, but prior to the development of the automobile, if you were a farmer in Talbot County, what was the scope, the dimension of your market? How was it determined? You know, if you had a load of corn, potatoes, and you were landlocked, you weren't fortunate enough to be sitting on one of the rivers where you could just plunk your stuff onto a boat to take it to market. What was the limits of your marketing availability?
Transportation.
Excuse me?
Transportation.
Yeah, and what transportation did you have?
The railroad.
If you didn't have these, and the railroad only ran in very specific areas, and so what were you limited by?
As far as your horse could take.
Yeah, a horse and buggy. And
roads that.
the limits of a horse and buggy, the limits both for personal transportation as well as for moving whatever your produce was about 5 miles
Wow.
prior to the development. And as a result of that, the evolution or the development, they didn't really start, but they certainly grew, of small towns and villages throughout Talbot County after the Civil War. The period from 1865 down to that, 1915, is what some historian has called the golden age of towns and villages in Talbot County. And a few data points. Y Mills, where we saw that manufacturing facility, has a population of 300 people in the 1880s. It has 3 churches, 5 general stores, an ice cream parlor, and 2 blacksmiths in Y Mills. Trapp in the 1880s has 18 general stores.
Wow.
Oxford grew from approximately 250 people to 750 people. There aren't 750 people today in Oxford. So these small towns, this is their heyday. And with the advent of that, with the advent of Route 50, with the advent of the bridge, that reverses. Okay. Enough for the moment about economics, and we'll shift to more of the social aspects. I put this picture up there. I love this picture, if for no other reason. And look at the kid.
It's got a Confederate hat on.
Yeah.
Got a Confederate hat. Guess what side of the war this woman was on. I don't know her name, but I cannot swear that she's from Talbot County. She is from Maryland. But I thought it just captured, better than any other picture I've seen, the mindset of at least a certain portion of Talbot County. And I don't even know that this was taken during the Civil War. It's possible that this was taken after the war. But it certainly captures the mindset of a certain segment. And the point there is that the Civil War really fractured Talbot County. And I would argue that the residue of that fracturing still can be seen to a certain extent today. Even in the politics of Talbot County, but in other areas of life as well. Talbot County in 1860 was 50% black. And half of that 50% was free, and half of that 50% were enslaved individuals. Now, we say free, and it's not quite a euphemism, but almost, because what's free to you is not free to black people, be it slave or quote unquote free in 1860 or even 1880, or you get my gist. Interestingly, there was considerable sentiment in Talbot County among whites that slavery was not appropriate for Talbot County. Now, how do we know that? Well, the best way we know that is lots and lots of people, slave owners, were getting rid of their slaves in Talbot County in the period from the War of 1812 over the next 40, 45 years. They were emancipating their slaves. Why were they doing that? Well, some of them, Quakers and some Methodists, were doing it because they believed it was the right thing. But many more were doing it for economic reasons. And it was sort of patently obvious what they were doing. And didn't just happen here in Talbot County. It happened throughout lots of areas in the upper South where slavery was no longer economically viable. What they would do is that they would hold on to their slaves till such point that they were no longer economically viable. So for women, usually that meant, well, we'll hold on to you during your childbearing years. But as soon as that's done with, you're free. For men, very often what you would see is sort of a cutoff date. You will be free if you behave yourself at age 25, 30, 35, I think is the oldest I've seen as the cutoff.
Wasn't there a federal limit beyond which you could not manumit a slave?
There were some, although I'm not aware that it was a federal limit. There were state limits, I know. States passed because what some slave owners were doing then were keeping their slaves up until age 50, which for a slave back in the 1860s was ancient, and then saying, you're free.
They didn't want
Oh,
to
yeah?
starve them.
Now what do I do?
Exactly. And they-
So some states did enact legislation, and I think Maryland was one of them, if I'm not mistaken. So the war comes along, and slave owners in this county are of two minds as to how to respond. Some insist that they're going to hold on to their slaves for as long as they can or sell them south. And there were slave sales here in Talbot County right up through 1863. In fact, I think the last slave sale was advertised in the Easton Gazette in August of 1863, no, May of 1863. Others, like, I'm blanking, I'm so bad on names, White House.
Lloyd.
Lloyd, yeah, Edmund Lloyd, seventh. Maybe we've already told you this story. Marches 100 of his male slaves down to the wharf and literally sells them to the federal army to the tune of $300 apiece. Blacks enroll in the federal army in some significant amounts and make, here we go. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. I will come back to him. There's one black soldier, again from Maryland. I can't swear he's from Talbot County. It's interesting. You don't find many Union soldiers, at least not I've seen, pictures of Union soldiers with their families. So I thought this was sort of interesting that he had his wife and 2 children with him.
Is that because they were split up and sold off, that the family had dispersed before the war?
I'm sorry.
Was that because the slave owner had sold pieces of the family?
It's possible. I think the other element is, quite frankly, the family unit, I think, had more symbolic meaning, particularly for former slaves who were denied the fact that they could have a legal family. And so once they were freed, like this gentleman, I mean, he was obviously proud of the fact that he was in the Union Army, and I think equally proud of the fact that he had a family with him as well. So you get, as we said before, 250 blacks from Talbot County who enlist in the federal army. And the interesting thing, they're in the, particularly 2 regiments in the Union Army, the 4th and the 7th Regiment of United States Colored Troops, USCT. Most blacks who were enlisted into the federal army were used for what purpose?
Cooking.
To serve, to serve the officers?
Well, no, very few were, but
Cooking,
To fight
digging.
Yeah.
Oh, hard labor stuff.
yeah, they were.
Not battle.
I mean, the notion was by the initially 1861, 1862, a lot of folks, including Abraham Lincoln, were resistant to the notion of using blacks as soldiers. They, of course, were resistant, including Lincoln, to freeing.
Why was that? What was the justification?
Well, as Lincoln said in 1863, think about it. You're a black man, and you're offered the opportunity
Shoot a white man.
to be killed in battle. And you say, huh? What's it get me? And as Lincoln said, the only reason that that black man is going to put on a uniform and put his life at risk is if he gets something, and the only thing he really wants is
Freedom.
freedom. That's what he wants. Well, we weren't
There you go.
about to give black people freedom in 1861 or 1862. By 1863, after two and a half years of civil war and lots of white men being ground up, killed, maimed, and otherwise brutalized in the war effort, and the war effort by 1863, particularly prior to Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which happened in the late summer. Prior to that, the war was going very badly. And Lincoln was having trouble. There were draft riots in New York City. And Lincoln was having real problems recruiting enough white men for the army. And a little light went on in his head and said, the only place I'm going to be able to get an adequate supply of troops is in the black population. And if they're going to fight, we need to give them freedom. It's the only way it's going to happen. And so here in Talbot County, as I said before, about 200 to 250 recruits. They come home from the war. A fair number of them came back to Talbot County. Unionville, we'll talk about that in a second. And like many veterans of the Civil War is the first war for a lot of things. But it's the first war in the history of the United States that you had this notion of veterans as an organized entity and getting together for social purposes. And ultimately, they also got together for political purposes. And one political purpose in particular they got together for, well, a couple of them, but one in particular, sort of, you might say, selfish political purpose.
Veterans benefits.
Oh, what?
Veterans benefits.
Veterans benefits. The whole notion of veterans benefits comes out of the Civil War. The pension.
Well, you start seeing that if you do anything on your ancestry or something like that, you'll find some of those records.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly. So here in St. Michael's had a significant black population before the war. Some of those veterans come home to St. Michael's, and the Grand Army of the Republic, that was the name of this veterans organization, the GAR. And there were 2 or 3 different lodges of the GAR in the St. Michael's area. And theoretically, the GAR did not discriminate. You know, if you read the stuff they put out from Washington, where the headquarters was, they didn't discriminate. If you were a veteran, you were a veteran. Didn't matter whether you're white or black or pink or whatever. Except when these guys in St. Michael's went knocking on the door to the veterans organizations there, they said, nah, we don't think so. We don't think so. We don't want you. And so they started their own in that building, where today you can get a cup of coffee. Because there's a coffee shop in that building in St. Michael's now.
What's it called?
Blue Grove.
I don't know, there's, I have another picture, but not here. That emblem on top
Blue Crab.
above the door, what's it?
It's Blue Crab, it's right.
Yeah, Blue
It's
Crab.
got the police department on
Yeah.
one side and the library on the other.
Yeah, and this is the
Oh,
emblem on the front of the building. It's there. Next time you go to get a cup of coffee or park, because you can't find a parking space in the main street, plaque's there. Established 1867, 2 years after the war was over. I think it's neat that, I assume whoever owns that building, memorialized it that way. Okay,
Excuse me,
one of the, yes,
how successful were they in their pension acquisition effort?
I'm glad you asked that. One of the, somebody mentioned, Lynn mentioned, you go online, you can find the pension records of these fellows. To make, like much else, it's a mixed bag. They were certainly more successful than you might think, because the federal bureaucracy, at least on some level, didn't discriminate. I mean, I haven't found much evidence of those bureaucrats sitting there and saying, he's a black man,
No pension?
no pension. But the problem that the Pension Bureau, at least initially, was fairly scrupulous in making you demonstrate that you qualified for a pension. And in order to qualify for a pension, you had to, number one, obviously serve, but you also had to be in some way, shape, or form disabled as a function of the war. Okay? Now, white veterans typically didn't have too much of a problem with that, because they had a fair amount of either documentation or at least legitimate verbal evidence that before the war, I had 2 arms, I had 2 legs, I could run up and down and do all sorts of stuff, but now after the war is over, I ain't got an arm, and I'm walking, like this. And it's obvious I got shot up in the war. Now, for black recruits, none of them had any written evidence prior to the war of having gone to a doctor. I mean, you kidding? And the other problem was many of them went into the war like this, as a function of working as enslaved laborers. And they came out of the war even worse.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
On active duty, I understand the blacks were paid less than the whites.
Yeah, initially.
So were they paid the same then as veterans?
Yeah,
That would be
yeah, there
surprising.
was no discrimination.
Really?
No.
That's surprising.
No.
was it difficult for widows to give pensions?
Yeah, widows could be given pensions as well. And again,
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. I fed you that line. For a white widow, prove you're the widow. Well, here's my,
Oh, gosh.
Reverend so-and-so signed it right there. 1846 in the Methodist Church. So the black women,
May not even have been married.
Well, they weren't
Yeah.
allowed to be.
They weren't allowed.
Yeah.
now,
That's why they jumped over the broom.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was not an insuperable barrier. Many of them got over it. And what I found in the pension records is that sometimes, interestingly, for Talbot County veterans, whites came to the fore, saying, this guy deserves a pension. And because the person who was testifying for him was white, that sort of evidence stood up, whereas some other guy who gets 3 of his black friends to testify for him, we don't know whether we can trust that testimony. That whole pension situation is really interesting.
If you can't read and write, collecting documents also is
Yeah, well, that's the other thing.
difficult. You know. You don't know what's
You
on
guys
it.
are doing great. You're feeding me my lines here. Many couldn't read. A few could, but many could not. And so, again, what you have is individuals who get into the business of being intermediaries for both black and white veterans, but more so for the black veterans than the white veterans, because the black ones needed it more. And there's one guy, not Nace Hopkins, Joe. What's Joe's last name?
Gray. Gray.
Thank you. I wrote an article on him. Joe Gray. God, I'm so. All right. Joe Gray. Joe Gray was a enslaved individual in Talbot County. Smart. So smart that he becomes a overseer of sorts on the farms that he works. Civil War comes along, he enlists, he impresses folks in the Union Army, he becomes a corporal. In fact, I found he became a corporal on the first day he enlisted. So he must have impressed somebody. He comes out of the Army, and he comes out of the Army with a degree of illness. He wasn't wounded, but he had all sorts of illnesses coming out. And the reason that many blacks came out of the Army with illnesses is because they were given the crappiest assignments, and they were put into the most inhospitable physical situations. And he had been serving down in Louisiana. So anyway, he comes out of the war, and he's suffering as a function of the war, and he files for a pension. And he's relentless. He's relentless. You should see his file. It's like this.
And he can read and write?
He gets a pension, and he gets 2 or 3 increases in his pension over the period from 1867 to when he dies at the end of the century, about 1900. But that's not good enough for Joe. Joe, number one, becomes a Republican operative in Easton. In fact, I can show you this house on, I can't think of the name, but where is the black church? The AME church.
Several.
What avenue is that?
Brooklyn, Glenwood. There's one on Glenwood, there's one on Hanson, there's one.
Yeah,
on-
Hanson, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, Joe's house is still there on Hanson Street, just up, 2 or 3 up from the church. Anyway, he becomes a Republican operative, and the white Republicans are only too happy to use him, and they do use him to the hilt in terms of enlisting black votes. He's in hopes that he's going to be tabbed to run for office. He does once, the first black man ever to run for office in Talbot County. He ran for mayor. He loses, but just the fact that he had the chutzpah to run was remarkable. He's never given a paid office by the white higher-ups. They save those paid offices for their buddies, their white buddies. But Joe goes through, he gets himself a pension and says, I can make a business on getting other people pensions. And that's what he does. He goes into the business of taking, the only evidence I've seen is that he works purely with black veterans who can't read, can't write, can't make out these pension applications for themselves, and he does it. And develops a bit of a business. So that's Joe Gray. That whole pension dimension to things is really an interesting one. And is one of the few of only places that I'm aware of prior to the New Deal in the 1930s that blacks were able to tie in to federal support of any sort. Okay, Harriet, the only reason I put Harriet up there is that she, during the war, what did Harriet do during the war?
She was five.
Underground Railway.
She also,
Well,
she also ran a
but
regiment.
after that,
She also ran a regiment, right? She ran a regiment. in these-
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And, okay,
She also applied for a pension.
she was what?
She applied for a pension.
Yeah, she did, and never got it, that I'm aware of. Yeah, yeah, because, again, they were sticklers. I don't think it had to do with her being,
Blacks, but being a woman.
yeah, she was a woman, and a woman couldn't enlist in the army. The one area of the county where it was possible after the Civil War for a black person to get access to land happened in Unionville as a function of these 2 people and their 2 sons, the Cogills. When I first came across them, I was pronouncing it Cowgill, and then somebody put me up against the wall and said, Cogill. Okay, Cogill. Before we get into the Cogills, any place else in the county, it was very difficult after the war for a black person to get access to land. You certainly couldn't get access to land in any white populated area. So even in towns like Trapp had a history of being fairly hospitable to black people. Try and buy a piece of real estate if you were black after the Civil War in Trapp, and it ain't gonna happen. On the other hand, you did have people in the Trapp. Trapp is the largest of the, for lack of a better term, municipalities in Talbot County. I think it takes like a third of the landmass of Talbot County is Trapp. And once you got out into the hustings, so to speak, there you did find some blacks who were able to buy a home, even some who were able to buy farms out in that area, but you couldn't do it in the center of town. You certainly couldn't do it in St. Michael's, despite the fact that it had a history also, supposedly, of being friendlier than some other areas. Easton. Easton is interesting. In fact, do I have a slide on? No, I don't. I don't have a slide. You did find black enclaves in Easton. There were two of them. One is very well known, the Hill. Now, why it's called the Hill, because there ain't no hill, but it was called the Hill. And the reason that blacks were able to take up residence in the Hill, in my estimation, is because they got there before anybody else. There have been blacks in that section of town going back to the Revolutionary War period. So they sort of had their stake in the ground before the whites moved in. The other place in which you found blacks was called the Bottom. And the Bottom would suggest it would be where?
Near the water.
Near the river down here.
Lowland or something.
Near Easton Point.
Yeah, near Easton Point, by the river, by land that just about nobody else wanted. And so you folks didn't live there. But other than that, you didn't find blacks in Easton, despite the fact that lots of them worked in Easton, but they couldn't live here unless they lived in one of those two areas. Okay. The Cogills move into the Unionville area before the Civil War, in the 1850s. Cogill buys a farm right next to our friends Lloyd's. Yeah. Lloyd and Whitehouse is the largest estate in all America. 450 enslaved individuals. So many enslaved individuals that at some point in the 1830s and the 1840s, he had to put a couple hundred on a boat and send them down to Mississippi and Alabama and start plantations down there with his excess labor. He sets up shop on his farm, and he goes like this to Mr. Lloyd. Now, he doesn't do that literally. He does it one better. He says, okay, you got 450 slaves. I'm going to hire 10 free black people to work for me. And I'm going to pay them good wages, and I'm going to house them well, and I'm going to take good care of them, and I'm going to show the world that black people can be as productive as white people. You don't have to enslave them to have them be productive. The election of 1860, how many votes did Lincoln get? Two. And they think they can't prove it. He was one, and one of his sons was the other.
Oh, that's right.
The war is over. Cogill and his wife decide they're going to take a chunk of their land and rent it to aspiring black farmers or what have you. And they rent plots of land, none of which were really large enough to farm on, but at least they could establish a home on them. And they call it Well, initially, the whites wanted to call it Cogelton. And the blacks said, no. And Kogel said, no, we're calling it Unionville. Again, sticking it in the eye to the whites, most of whom were not fans of the Union or the Union War effort. So Unionville begins to develop with the help of the Cogills. When he dies in about 1880, his son, James Cogill, takes over. And James does the old man one better. Because the old man had rented long leases, 30-year leases for $1 a year. And if you couldn't pay the $1, well, give me a sack of potatoes or something, and I'll consider it even. But his son, as I say, does it one better. He sells them the land. And again, it's fascinating to go online. In fact, you don't have to go online. You just got to go over to the courthouse. And in the courthouse, as many of you may be aware, there's every land transaction that ever happened is documented in Talbot County. And you take these books down, big books down, put them there. And if you can figure out how the thing is organized, and you go down and you find, James Cogill, $100 to Nathan Smith for 50 acres. James Cogill, $100 to Albert Brown for so many acres. And he does that 40 or 50 times over the period of 1880 through about 1910. He sells land, sells homes in Unionville to these blacks, which was remarkable for the time, just remarkable. And Unionville, at least there's a residue of it there still today.
Very active.
It's not in the shape that it was at one time. I'll be right with you.
Sure.
Now that obviously is after the Cogill's time. That was probably in the 1930s or so for the Unionville School. Yes.
I'm curious about the Cogills' philosophy or religious.
Quakers.
They were Quakers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I can't really speak to, there are, just like any religion, there are Lutherans and Lutherans, there are Jews and there are Jews, and there are Quakers and there are Quakers. So how devout they were. Certainly the one son, I get the two sons mixed up, but I believe it was James, enlists in the Union Army and goes fights. Well, that's not the Quaker way to pick up a rifle. So he obviously didn't adhere too much to the Quaker way.
But he was supporting the idea of emancipation.
Yeah, absolutely. But certainly during the period of, again, when the Unionville starts in 1870, down through the 1950s and 1960s, Unionville was the one place in Talbot County that there was a semblance of a decent life, an equitable life for Black people in this county. The unfortunate part is that while there was a equitable life, there was not a particularly productive life, because there simply were few, if any, economic opportunities in the Unionville area. So what you find is that many folks there leave Unionville. Some of them left and came back. There was a real shuttle between Unionville and Baltimore in particular, Unionville and Washington. Others leave, never come back. Yeah.
There's a substantial population still there, many of whom are descendants of those original ones. And the other thing is, it is not the most desirable land.
No.
If you try to drive through Unionville during or after a heavy rainstorm, you find out why it isn't
Yeah.
desirable
Yeah.
land.
Just a quick aside, this spring, Harriet Lowry, who is a descendant of the Unionville families,
Mhm.
is teaching a class. So you might enjoy sitting in on her class.
She's very articulate
Mhm.
and knows a lot of history.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What, is she teaching through the Chesapeake Forum?
Yes,
Oh,
Yeah.
and her, how do you
Yeah.
know her name?
you'll see it on the website, and you get you'll be, if you're
Yes.
new to Chesapeake Forum, you'll start getting our newsletter,
Okay,
and you'll be in the newsletter.
great.
Harriet
Unionville, though, is unique. More typical was this picture. This is the Willis household in Trapp. And I didn't bring that with me. The Willises, that's Nicholas Willis over there on the right. He and his father before him established this farm in Trapp in, again, the 1850s, and held on to it for at least 100 years. And the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things, is that the two Willises, he and his father before him, and then I guess his son after him, kept a journal, a daily journal, which Jim Dawson down at the Unicorn Bookstore in Trapp has edited. I should have brought it. No. It's about this thick. It was published, and it's fascinating reading. Now, I don't know that anybody's going to read, 100 years, but you go through that, and it really gives you a sense for rural life in Talbot County from the middle of the 19th through the middle of the 20th century, and the difficulties that these folks faced in terms of making a living, dealing with Mother Nature. Winters for winters in the Willis talks about 2 and 3 foot snows in 1870s and 1880s. But the interesting thing is those two folks in the middle. The woman was a Willis slave. Now, this picture was taken in the 1890s, actually. So the interesting question is, okay, here's a woman. She was a young woman as a slave, but not a baby. She was a young woman who has elected to stay on with the Willises, and she stayed with them almost to the end. A couple of years later, after that picture was taken, she moved into Easton and ultimately died there. When Nicholas Willis was on his deathbed, she came back and nursed him. So that, the stereotype that you might have of those racial dynamics begin to fall apart on the individual level because there were all sorts of relationships. And the young man, I love that picture. That's that young man. He's about 10. I submitted this. Do I have this? Yeah, I don't have it. I submitted an article to the Maryland Historical Journal. Hello. And I submitted some pictures along with it, thinking they like pictures with their articles. And the editor of the journal took one look at that picture and said, I love that picture. And they put it on the cover of that. And the mere fact that the young man, I mean, that's not clothes he would normally wear to work. Now, the fact he had the clothes is interesting. How he came by them, I have no idea.
What is he holding? Is that a whip?
It's a hat.
Excuse me?
Oh, it's a hat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like it.
it's a hat and a cannon, toy cannon. You know, he's proudly displaying his toy.
Oh, I see, the one.
Yeah.
Okay. And
So, this was one among thousands of relationships on farms throughout Talbot County. That is not the Willis farm. That is in Trapp, and that's the home of a tenant farmer. That's, if anything, could be said to be typical of the living conditions that tenant farmers, both black and white, but largely black, lived in Talbot County. That is. And I love this juxtaposition. That certainly by the time at the end of this period, World War I, it was becoming increasingly obvious that there were really two Talbot counties, and Y House and that tenant farmer's house is sort of graphic of that.
And is that home still, is that home still in white? The mansion?
Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
never
It was
consulted.
just restored about 10 or 12
It's
years
still
ago.
in the same
Yeah.
family. Yeah.
Great, okay. I'm from Baltimore, sorry.
yeah, occasionally they will allow, and it's still in the hands of the family. And occasionally they will let various groups use it for fundraisers and the like. I've never been in it. I would love to, but I haven't been. I stand down at the end of the driveway and gaze up at it.
Well, that's not.
I'm going to end with this graph that the population of Easton after the Civil War has undergone some dramatic transformations. What you find is that that's Easton. Let's do Talbot County first. What you find in Talbot County as a whole, the blue line or box or whatever you want to call it is the black population. Surprise, surprise, the black population has in fact gone down. At one point, as we said before, the black population was 50% of the population of this county. It is no longer anything close to that number. It's not 25% of the county even. The white population, on the other hand, has grown dramatically over the years. And on that last 2010, you see the, whatever that is,
Hispanic.
fuchsia or whatever. And that's the Latino population, which doesn't even appear
No.
in 1870 or 1920.
In the 2020 census, the Hispanic population exceeds the black population.
Okay.
Wow.
Does it?
Uh-huh.
That's interesting. I couldn't come up with 2020 numbers.
You have to dig.
Yeah.
It's hard to find.
It's
Um,
agricultural.
The other interesting thing is that the black population, while in Talbot County overall has gone down, those who have remained have shifted into Easton. The black population of Easton has in fact grown over time. And that's a function, at least I would argue, of two things. Number one, economics. Jobs are in Easton, they're not out in the countryside, at least not the jobs that folks want. And those two enclaves in Easton of blacks have been comfortable areas for people to move into. Again, the white population has gone through the ceiling, much to the chagrin of some folks. And the Latino population of Easton pretty much mirrors the Latino population of the county as a whole, which is to say, where are they moving? They're moving to Easton. So,
May I ask a question?
yeah,
Just demographically speaking, there was something that happened on the Eastern Shore that grew retirement populations. Pardon me?
Seniors, yeah.
Yeah, seniors. That there was something demographically that drew seniors to settle in their retirement. Right? In the Eastern St. Michael's area.
yeah.
Well, I'm not saying it accounts for all of that, but there were lots of things going on that's not just economic, it's about lifestyle.
Right.
Yeah.
The senior population today in Talbot County is over 30%.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
And it's expected to go to 39% by the end of the
Thank you,
decade.
that's one.
Yeah. The average age in Talbot County is something on the order of 55.
That's correct.
And the average age in Maryland as a whole, if I'm not mistaken, is about 37. So there's a dramatic difference. And that is probably going to skew more and more over time. And there's a whole other course on what's going on in Talbot County, and should there be growth, should there not be growth, and all of that. And
We have a course on that coming up next semester too.
yeah,
Right there.
take that course.
Your son is teaching.
All right.
Wait, could I hear the name of the course?
It's being taught by Pete Lesher, who's a councilman for the county. And he'll be talking about not just growth, but actually quite a bit about growth, but environmental impacts and decisions that have to be made.
So we'll wind things up by saying thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
You. And
When are you coming back?
yeah, there's some interesting stuff out there on Talbot County, and I brought most of them with me today. One interesting thing is that there hasn't been much written of late. These two little ones, these aren't on Talbot County, these are just on Maryland about the war by Claudia Floyd. Anybody know Claudia? I'd like to make her acquaintance. She's not a university historian by any stretch. Doesn't have a Ph.D., but has done some really interesting work on the Civil War in Maryland. I picked these up, quite frankly, thinking, these are going to sort of be puff pieces Not, really, really good pieces. This, of course, is the Bible for Maryland, Brugger's book.
Can you turn and face towards the camera too?
Oh,
Oh, yes.
Maryland, A Middle Temperament, and it's, you know, it's a tome, there's no doubt about that, but it's the best thing that I found, and it was written, when was that written? 1988.
You should show our, put it in front of the camera so
Yeah.
people
Oh.
are catching. There you
Sorry,
go.
there we go.
Hopefully everyone can see that.
And Talbot County itself,
There.
this was written, when was this one written? 1983. So this is 40 years old. And, you know, it's decent, but it's more along the lines of vignettes than a comprehensive history of Talbot County. But it is what it is. I'm a little surprised that more hasn't been done, because it's it's such a fascinating place.
Now, these suggested readings, we put it into a Word doc. And when you get your email from us, probably tomorrow or later today with the video recording link, there'll be a link to our Google Docs, and you just click on that and you'll be able to pull this up and
Excellent.
you can download it to your own computer if you like.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I appreciate your attendance, your patience, and we'll pass the collection plate. I got it.
Thank you.